There's been so much happening in the news this week that conservative commentators have hardly had a chance to even mention Benghazi or to explain why Obamacare is such a job-killing failure, even though we've just had 52 months of consecutive job growth and 17 million people have signed up for health care. There are several things I want to comment on today, but I want to reveal the thread that ties this disparate list of events and thoughts together. We pick up a unifying concept in the passage from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, in which he is expressing some considerable displeasure about how the members of this church have been behaving. The church has had some internal squabbles. People are not getting along. There appears to be some considerable posturing on the part of some people who want to have more authority, more recognition than they were receiving, and there is nothing new in that. And to be entirely honest about it, people aren't the same. Some people are more vital to the existence of a church or a family, or for that matter, a business or even a nation than others are. We declare a moral principle that all people are created equal, but that goes to their value as human beings. We may be equal in value, but we are not the same. Paul acknowledges that there are differences, that people have, some people have more talents than others, more gifts, more ability than other people do. But he makes an important claim, and this is a claim that is at the heart of what it means to be a religious person. It's a claim that is vital to the difference between being a person who simply has liberal or progressive opinions and a person who is a spiritual person. He says, and you can see it right at the end of this little pericope that's printed in the bulletin, verse 7, everyone's got gifts. God's given everyone gifts for the common good. No one's got a gift for their individual good. The word personal that's bandied about in so much religious conversation, got to have a personal relationship with God or a personal relationship with Jesus. The word personal is not in the Bible. It's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament. It is not a concept that is affirmed in the Judeo-Christian tradition. You may have private aspects of your spirituality, but it's never secretive and it's never just for you. It's not self-stimulation. It is for the community. This is a way of seeing the world that you either agree with it or you don't agree with it. No one can say that one is right and the other is wrong. I stand up here and tell you that we are all connected, that the welfare of one person affects the welfare of everyone else. And you can go home tonight and watch Neil deGrasse Tyson on Cosmos, and as a scientist, he will tell you we are all connected, chemically, biologically, through physics. We are all connected. You could hear much the same sentiment echoed profoundly, poetically, in the teachings of Buddhism, of Judaism, and in Islam. Still, it's not universally acknowledged. You can hear it echoed even in news reports. We've had several fatal shootings in the past 2 weeks. Following a rampage at the University of California in Santa Barbara, Richard Martinez, whose son Christopher had been killed in that incident, went on TV and emphatically blamed his son's death not on the individual shooter, who was obviously suffering from mental illness. He blamed all the politicians and the NRA who have continued to make guns available to people who have mental illnesses. And he posed the question to the whole public and to our government: what is your individual right to own a gun compared to my son Christopher's right to be alive today? Now, the political sideshow made famous in 2012, known as Joe the Plumber, Joe the Plumber replied to his challenge. He said, "Your dead kids don't trump my constitutional rights." And there you have the crux of the conflict between a narcissistic worldview and a spiritual worldview, between a generous worldview and a compassionate worldview over against a self-serving, I got mine, I'll do what pleases me worldview. Individual rights versus the common good. Now, both are a part of any civilization. Individual rights have their place, as long as they don't affect the common good. The TV talk shows have been abuzz in the past month over a very complex and rather long book by the French economist Thomas Piketty. And I've been trying to read it. I know 2 or 3 others of you are as well. His exhaustive review of the evolution of capitalism in the industrialized world has documented both mathematically and historically what many of us have intuitively felt, that this growing income gap between the wealthy and the poor is inevitably pushing our society towards disaster. And more than simply income disparity, Piketty talks about the capital disparity. Who owns the capital? Who owns the buildings and the land and the natural resources? As land and precious resources are increasingly transferred into the hands of a smaller and smaller elite, then no amount of hard work, discipline, sacrifice, ingenuity can really get a person out of poverty. And that's the dimension that we're seeing. One of the things that Piketty is pointing out is that if the stock market is going up while there's not a real increase in total capital wealth, all that really means is the capital wealth is being transferred into the hands of the wealthy. As Bishop Desmond Tutu observed in his autobiography, he said, when missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. And they said, let us pray. So we closed our eyes. When we opened our eyes, we had the Bible and they had the land. That we have constructed our laws, our understanding of international trade in a way that the people who draw up the rules are the people who intend to own the land. And so Native American populations, African populations are driven off of the land where they had successfully built a civilization because we've got a concept of private ownership in the hands of a few. And if a few people own all of the capital, then all the rest of us are inevitably enslaved to those people. Piketty pointed out that it was only because we had a very progressive tax system in the United States after World War II, where the more money you made, the larger percentage of your income you paid, whereas now, the more money you make, the less percentage of your income you pay in taxes. But because we had a progressive tax system in the years following World War II, the United States moved up in the League of Nations to being the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world. Without a progressive tax system, we would still be a struggling former colony of Great Britain. The more we fail to invest in infrastructure, and infrastructure includes investment in the coming generation, education. My kids out of public school and out of college, I still want to pay taxes that support the public schools because I don't want to live around a bunch of stupid, uneducated people, right? We have a cultural, big footprint interest in our public schools being very, very successful. If we don't invest in infrastructure, education, technology, and medicine, then the capital assets of the nation continue to be transferred into the hands of the elite, and the total amount of capital goes down. This process ends in choking the economy and creating widespread poverty and suffering. Still, the political conversation revolves around whether we will continue to allow this to happen, or if we will change course, or if, in fact, we will simply accelerate what is happening. The budget proposed by Paul Ryan seeks to escalate this spiral into national poverty by cutting infrastructure and education investments by $1.2 trillion in order to give further tax cuts to the people who are already super wealthy. Now, you would think that someone would have to be just crazy to propose something like that. But I don't think I've got a but to that. I think you would have to be crazy to propose something like that. Just straight up nuts. Because it will inevitably destroy this nation and take away anything that meaningfully could be called freedom or opportunity. In the presence of crushing poverty, unemployment, and homelessness, there's no freedom There's no liberty. You may be free to live under a bridge if you want to, but you're not free to work hard, study, save, buy a house, have kids, and retire with dignity. Consider the case of the controversial prisoner exchange that took place earlier this week. President Obama orchestrated the release of Bergdahl from an Afghan prison controlled by the Taliban. In order to win his release, our president agreed to release 5 Taliban prisoners from our infamous prison in Guantanamo Bay. There's been a lot of public outrage about this for several reasons. Most importantly, because the prisoners released from Guantanamo Bay were said to be especially dangerous people who have a fierce hatred of Americans. Perhaps because we kept them in an offshore prison where they were tortured and mistreated for a decade without ever being charged with a crime or given a trial date. That tends to make people very angry. The other big reason concerns Sergeant Bergdahl himself. None of us have all the facts, but it appears that Bergdahl may have deserted his post after becoming disillusioned with the war, the Army, and America's given reasons for occupying Afghanistan in the first place. Before his capture, he had written to his parents, "Life is way too short to spend it on the damnation of other people, as well as helping fools with their ideas that are all wrong. I've seen their ideas, and they have made me ashamed to be an American. The horror of the self-righteous arrogance that they thrive in is revolting." Now, I've heard commentators railing against Bergdahl and his parents, even to the extent of blaming him for the deaths of several soldiers who later died while on patrol. They say they died searching for Bergdahl. I think that's an exaggeration to make Bergdahl seem much more guilty. People die on patrol, and they went on patrol, and there were deaths at that time of year. It's the time of year when the fighting is at its greatest in Afghanistan. The winters are hard enough that everyone hunkers down. There's not a big casualty rate during the winter. The casualty rate is in the summer, and at the very end of the summer, there's always a push. There's always an escalation of deaths. So whether these deaths had anything to do with Bergdahl is entirely suspicious to me, but they're trying to blame him for that because we're taking a huge amount of wrong, social wrong, and pointing at one person, saying it's his fault. I want you to try to see this in terms, though, of the nation as a whole, and not just what a 23-year-old. Is it okay to call a soldier a kid? Is that okay? Because my daughter's 25 now, and she's all grown up and a fully mature woman, but at 23, I would say she was still a kid. I tend to think about how would my daughter have acted in those circumstances at that age. So deserting while you're on the battlefield does endanger your peers. That is not an insignificant charge. However, he had been lied to. You've been lied to. Why are we occupying Afghanistan 12 years after we have blown up whatever terrorist training camps were there prior to 9/11? There are those clamoring now for Bergdahl to be put on trial and to be sentenced to several years in an American military prison for having deserted his post. Where's the hue and cry for putting our current and former presidents on trial for having lied to us to get us into these wars in the first place? Why is the Congress not being held responsible for sending 20 and 21 and 22-year-old boys and girls onto a battlefield under false pretenses and expecting them to faithfully die in defense of what has become little more than a smokescreen for the continued transfer of capital into the hands of the elite? As Elizabeth Warren has been pointing out, for what we have spent on these wars, we could have made going to college in the United States entirely free to everyone. We could have wiped out student debt and just not charged tuition to go to school. And you have to understand, an awful lot of these soldiers that have died, and a lot of the soldiers that are over there, are in Afghanistan and they are in Iraq because they couldn't afford to go to college without military service. This is the economic oppression in which we take the poor of America to go and kill the poor of Afghanistan and Iraq. But our Congress won't even agree to lower the interest rate on student loans. We have impoverished so many Americans and cut support of our universities and trade schools so that anyone who has the ambition to go to school and study is then in turn enslaved by a student loan debt that keeps them from ever being able to own a home or even plan to have children. I know people with professional degrees who are not going to have children because they can't afford them. Their student loan payments are so high that they cannot also have children. Our Congress then is literally enslaving these students with a loan burden, not because it costs us so much to loan them money, but because we are making over $10 billion a year of profit off the backs of poor and lower income students who borrowed money to go to college. Yet it is a sobering thought to release 5 Taliban prisoners who are highly motivated to strike back at us. But don't kid yourselves. 5 people is a drop in the bucket, a bucket that contains millions upon millions who have come to see this conflict in the Middle East through the smokescreen, just like Sergeant Bergdahl did. We need to stop counting on our fingers and step back and look at the big picture. This is not one ballet dancing California-raised soldier who got himself into a bind in Afghanistan. And it's not a couple of hundred prisoners that we've kept offshore where no one could see what we've been doing to them for 12 years. It's not the individuals, it's the whole. We are all connected. So do we need to keep Bergdahl in prison? Or should we maybe trade 5 or 6 members of Congress who helped send him to Afghanistan with a gun in his hands and trade them to the Taliban for Bergdahl? Should Bergdahl be put on trial, or should the president who told us that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the senators who voted for war on false pretenses and an illegal occupation be put on trial? And this applies to Senator John McCain and to Senator Hillary Clinton, both of whom approved the invasion and occupation of lands for which we had no provocation to go into. Is Edward Snowden a bad guy for giving away classified American intelligence? Should he, as Senator John Kerry has suggested, come home and stand trial for treason? Or should the White House administration that has carried on illegal spying of American citizens from one coast to the other be put on trial? Private Manning is serving a 35-year prison sentence for leaking documents regarding war crimes that were committed by our soldiers against Afghan and Iraqi civilians. Manning is in prison for revealing the truth. The war criminals have not been charged, reprimanded, demoted, or even subjected to public shame. We blame the poor for being poor. We lie to our young soldiers and put them in prison if they stop believing the lies. Should Manning be in prison, or should the people who authorize torture under the shameful nomenclature of enhanced interrogation be put in prison? Or maybe, just maybe, maybe we should stop looking for individuals to blame, to put on trial, to drag through the media and lock away, either into a tiny Pashtun-operated jail or at Gitmo or the Fed Med in Springfield. Maybe we need to start realizing how we are all connected, that your dead kids really are more important than my personal rights to have an arsenal in my basement. We can realize that among the 100,000 civilians we've killed in Iraq, there were people who were just as victimized by terrorism as we feel like we've been. Bergdahl, Snowden, Manning, these are not our enemies. Each of these young men made questionable decisions with possibly dire results, but each one simply stood up in the midst of a society that was morally going off the rails and tried to do something to wake up the rest of us, to make us pay attention, to remind us that we're not the kind of people who torture prisoners, or who spy on millions of innocent people, or who occupy foreign lands on shaky pretense. Is it just me, Or is it that the longer that we engage in a war on terrorism, that we come to look and act more and more like terrorists? The wealth, technological skill, scientific knowledge, and ingenuity of this nation is not for a handful of billionaires. It's for the common good. Nations, the freedom and liberty that this nation loves is not a club that we use to destroy other nations, to occupy their lands and steal their resources. It is, at least from this pastor's point of view, for the common good.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.